welcome back to a little show we like to call Roll with the Troll. Once again, it is just me. It's just the troll here today. The voice of reason is still out of town. This is 2 fucking days now. No voice of reason. The show's off kilter without the voice of reason. Let me tell you, this is why they didn't want women in the fucking workplace. You know what I'm talking? Some men fought very hard long ago to ensure that they never one day would see something like this happen, where someone's got a successful YouTube show and their co-host is gone for days at a time, leaving everything in shambles. So that's what these men were thinking about 130 years ago. Anyway, look, I'm going to try to do the show myself. Halloween. I want to talk about how the Halloween series is different from the other horror films from my perspective. Now, I grew up in the 80s when horror had really changed. Horror, and I would even say heavy metal music, both got a lot more intense and a lot crazier in the 80s. Like thrash metal came out in metal. And as far as horror films went, everything got a lot more graphic, right? There wasn't even really blood until the 80s. And then we got tons of blood. And then it just became a contest year after year to see how much more blood and intensity they could throw into things. And also the idea of like multiple sequels, that really wasn't being done until then. So I feel like I grew up at a really interesting time when I got to watch this sort of coming of age of horror films and their creators just testing the limits, testing all the boundaries to see what they could get away with and what the public would respond to. And I remember there were jokes, like when Friday the 13th 4 or 5 came out, there were jokes that like people were saying, what are they going to do? 8 of them, 9 of them, 13 of them? This is crazy. And you wouldn't have, like, people would joke about, would these movies still be going on decades and decades later? And of course, no one really thought they would be. And here we are. I mean, fucking Halloween is going on 50 years before you know it. And I'm sure it's not too much longer before we have Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and other ones back too. So anyway, I want to just do a little compare and contrast for a few minutes here. Since Halloween Ends is now less than just over 4 months away. So I thought it'd be a nice time to kind of do this. So let's get into it, guys. All right, check it out. I want to compare to a few horror films or horror series. Let's compare Halloween to Saw for a second, all right? I thought the first Saw was fucking gold. I thought the first Saw, in many ways, had a lot of what Halloween had to offer. It had an intrigue. It had mystery. And it had a lot of suspense. I think, other than the Halloween series, I don't think I've really seen another horror film be quite as focused on suspense as Saw was. That first Saw was great. Now, the problem with Saw is I think a lot of us agree that the second one was an okay follow-up. It really wasn't as good. It was very different. And they really sucker punched us with what they did with Jigsaw in the sequels. They took some very strange turns that I don't think were really the right way to go. It was different. It was definitely different. It just wasn't necessarily all that great. Most of us feel like the first Saw was gold, and after that, it kind of fell apart. And I think it stayed way too long, man. By Saw 3, I was pretty much done. They hung in there for more sequels, but I don't really think any of that shit was really working. So Halloween was similar in some ways there, but Halloween was able to keep the suspense into the sequels, I think, really well and keep you interested in Michael Myers and these other characters too. Then let's talk about Scream. Okay, Scream was like the epitome of what made the 90s less cool than the 80s to me for movies and music and a lot of things. Scream sort of wanted to poke fun at its own genre. You know, it wanted to be kind of spoofy, but at the same time, it was like wanted to have its cake and eat it too. It also wanted to still try to be a real horror movie. And that kind of worked. And that's how a lot of things went in the 90s. It's just kind of what was being done then. But I never really cared much for Scream. And I think mainly because they wanted so much to be both funny and then still try to jump into horror, but then kind of come back to funny. And it just was never really for me. Now, Halloween never fucked with that. Even in the 90s when they did get a little bit more influenced by other 90s horror films, they never went anywhere like that. They kept Michael, right? We never really saw anything trying to be funny. They always kept a very creepy tone. And that's one of the things I really loved about the Halloween franchise and still do. They've never gotten silly. They've always, even in Halloween 5, which is probably a little bit guilty of trying to be to have more levity. You know, they had a lot of little jokes and shit thrown in. Even then, I still think the focus was on the horror and on, for the most part, suspense. All right, so let me talk about Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. These were the two that influenced me the most as a kid. I saw those franchises all the way through, or as far as they were at the time, before I ever saw a Halloween film. I didn't see a Halloween film until well after I knew those two franchises really well. And to me, Freddy is creepy as fuck, right? Freddy is extremely creepy. But again, it was like, it was kind of Screamish before Scream in the way that they really wanted to have an emphasis on comedy. Sometimes you're supposed to be scared. Other times you're just supposed to go, what the fuck am I watching? And even Friday the 13th did that a little bit, probably around the fifth film and even a little bit into the sixth. They didn't want to take themselves too seriously because, there were many sequels in and they were getting kind of silly and they knew that. And so they kind of did what Cobra Kai is doing today, where they want to poke fun at themselves a little because they don't want to look like they're taking themselves too seriously. Halloween never did that. Halloween, again, I always loved because you know what you're getting into with any Halloween film, including those Rob Zombie movies that most of us don't really like. They still always kept things serious and they kept things really dark. By the way, one interesting thing I always thought about Jason from Friday the 13th was that he doesn't really kill kids. He's after the teenagers, he's after the adults, but he's not after the kids. And I always thought that was a really interesting spin that they gave him that kept that franchise very unique. With Michael, we've kind of seen both versions. We've seen a version of Michael that spares kids. We've seen a version that really doesn't. So I don't really know. I guess it just depends on which timeline we're in with Michael Myers in that regard. And then Freddy, of course, specializes in murdering children. I mean, Freddy is so into just terrifying children and haunting kids in every fucking way he can. So that was kind of an interesting thing too. I thought of those three killers as the biggest ones in all the horror films through the 80s into the 90s. And yet you had these different levels of how they would deal with young children. They'd all kill teenagers, of course. Most teenagers, let's face it, need to be butchered. It's a good idea. You see a fucking teenager, hack his fucking head off. But as far as the way these three were all very different in that way, I appreciated that. I always thought that was really cool, that if you've got these three major horror film franchises, that they all sort of have a different stance on the way they treat really young kids. Let's talk about Texas Chainsaw for a second, right? This was another one that got so spoofy and silly by the second film. First one was different. First one seemed to want to stay serious, I think. And by the second one, they already were just going off the fucking rails. They're introducing you to the family and getting kind of silly. So that was wildly different than Halloween, and it served a very different purpose. And again, Halloween to me was always so serious. And you've got movies like Elm Street and Texas Chainsaw where they wanted you to make it a real theater experience where you could have some fun and make it a real popcorn flick. I always appreciated that the Halloween series didn't really give you that. Halloween always wanted to keep you very on edge and creeped out. And they brought they still bring a certain level of darkness and just incredible personal horror to the films that I don't think are in any other real horror films out there. Not a lot of other horror films. I'll finish up by just mentioning a couple of movies that they didn't get sequels, but they each got a remake. Movies like I Spit on Your Grave and Last House on the Left. And there were a lot of other movies that were similar to those two, I felt. Those were really dark. Those were dark, creepy. They really were similar to Halloween in the sense that they tapped into, and even the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre too, in the way that they tapped into something where you're like, Jesus Christ, what am I seeing here? This is too real. It's too dark. And I love that about those films and a lot of their knockoffs and such. But again, I still have to say, I think Halloween was able to take the best elements of horror and combine them all together. So you get a fun experience, but you are scared, and the suspense is through the roof with Halloween. And even with these last two movies I mentioned, Last House and Spit on Your Grave, as much as they had suspense and they had such just incredible elements of horror, I'd still say the Halloween series, to me, just did a better job of getting all the right pieces together and to really hit you. And yet, they're the most enduring out of all of them. Halloween has been going on for so fucking long now. It's incredible. And where like Elm Street has been off for a long time, and then Friday the 13th has been off for a while. Here we still have Halloween that's never really taken too much time away. And even though they have to keep reinventing themselves, every time they seem to come back pretty fucking strong. So, with the exception maybe of the Rob Zombie films, I guess those ones weren't so strong. But every other timeline in Halloween, I think most of us can really enjoy for one reason or another. So, anyway, guys, look, I'm about out of time. Let me know in the comments. Let's talk about this. Let's compare the Halloween series and the different Halloween timelines to other horror films, especially horror franchises that are out there. We'll have the Voice of Reason back before long. Guys, thank you all for the support. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell to get more videos from the Troll and usually the Voice of Reason. I'll be back tomorrow, guys. Thanks.